In the order books of 17th-century Virginia and Maryland courts, tucked between boundary disputes and tobacco debts, there is a class of entry that most family trees have quietly stopped mentioning: a name, a term of years, and a sum of money. Somebody bought their own freedom, or somebody else bought it for them, and the county clerk recorded it in the same flat hand he used for everything else that crossed his desk that week: corn prices, a stray hog, a boundary line disputed by two neighbors. And then, a servant released early, the balance of a bond paid off in full. If your family has been in America since before the Revolution, and nobody can point to the ship that supposedly carried a proud free settler across the Atlantic, there is a real chance the actual answer sits in exactly this kind of ledger. Not a passenger list with a name at the top of the manifest, but a bond of servitude with a term attached to it, and eventually a receipt marking the day that term ended before it was legally required to. Some of these families never mentioned any of it again once they owned land of their own. A few of them left behind just enough paper that the story survived anyway, waiting in a courthouse basement or a state archive for someone to go looking. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The system that produced these records started almost as soon as English settlement did. The Virginia Company needed labor far more than it needed settlers with capital, and most of the people willing to cross an ocean for the promise of land had neither. So the company, and later the colony itself, built a mechanism to solve that problem. A person with nothing could sign a contract, usually for 4 to 7 years, exchanging their labor for the cost of passage, food, and shelter. In 1618, Virginia sweetened the arrangement further with the Headright system, granting 50 acres of land to anyone who paid to transport a laborer across the ocean, whether that laborer was a family member, a stranger, or simply a name purchased off a ship at dockside. The incentive worked exactly as designed. Merchants, ship captains, and planters had every reason to fill their holds with as many bodies as they could manage, and for more than a century, roughly half of all European immigrants to the colonies south of New England arrived this way, bound rather than free. England supplied most of the earliest servants, and it did so for reasons that had little to do with adventure. Enclosure had pushed small farmers off common land they had worked for generations. Port cities like Bristol and London filled with people who had no trade, no land, and no prospects, and a 4-year contract that fed and housed a person in exchange for hard labor on the other side of the Atlantic looked, to a genuinely desperate person, like an actual improvement. Not everyone signed willingly. The word kidnapper enters the English language directly out of this trade, describing the men who worked the docks luring or simply grabbing children and adults and delivering them onto ships bound for Virginia or Barbados before anyone could object. Bristol's city corporation grew so alarmed by complaints of exactly this practice that in 1654 it began requiring every servant leaving the port to appear before a magistrate and be formally registered by name, age, and destination before a ship could take them. The measure was meant to stop kidnapping. It also produced, almost as a side effect, one of the most complete surviving indexes of servant names anywhere in the English-speaking world, a register the Bristol Record Office still holds and that genealogists still search today. A different version of the same system took shape in the German-speaking Palatinate in Switzerland through the early 1700s, driven by war, high taxation, and land scarcity rather than the enclosures that had emptied the English countryside a century earlier. Whole families crowded onto ships at Rotterdam bound for Philadelphia, often without enough money to cover the full cost of the crossing. The captain would carry them anyway, on the understanding that whatever fare remained unpaid on arrival would be recovered by selling the debt itself, and the person who owed it, to whichever planter or tradesman needed labor and had cash in hand. Gottlieb Mittelberger, an organist who made the crossing in 1750 and later published an account of what he witnessed, described the practice in blunt terms: families standing on the deck of a ship anchored in the Delaware River, while merchants came aboard to inspect them the way they would inspect livestock, and children in some cases sold separately from their own parents to satisfy the debt. The people caught in this system called themselves redemptioners, because a relative who arrived later, or who had settled earlier and finally saved enough money, could redeem a family member out of a stranger's service. The word survives in the historical record for exactly the reason it sounds like it should. It describes a transaction, not a metaphor. Britain solved a separate problem the same way. After the Transportation Act of 1718, English and Welsh courts gained a formal alternative to hanging for a long list of lesser felonies, sentencing convicted offenders to 7 or 14 years of transportation to the American colonies instead. Something close to 50,000 people crossed the Atlantic under this sentence over the following decades, overwhelmingly to Virginia and Maryland, where merchants purchased the right to their labor from the ship captains who transported them the same way they purchased any other indentured servant. Decades before that system existed, Oliver Cromwell's campaigns in Scotland and Ireland produced their own wave of bound labor. Scottish prisoners captured at the Battle of Dunbar in 1650 and at Worcester the following year were shipped to New England by the hundreds, a portion of them put to work at the Saugus Iron Works in Massachusetts, under indenture rather than kept as ordinary prisoners of war. Irish men and women swept up during the same decade's brutal suppression of Ireland were transported to Barbados and the Chesapeake, in a practice contemporaries and later historians alike came to call being Barbadosed, a term that entered common speech, precisely because the experience was common enough to need one. Not every servant crossing the Atlantic was there because of a contract they had personally agreed to. English poor law authorities had the power to bind pauper and orphan children into apprenticeships at home, and in the earliest years of the Virginia colony, city officials in London used that same power to solve two problems at once: an overcrowded system of vagrant children and a colony desperate for labor. In 1619 and again in 1622, the City of London shipped groups of these children to Virginia under formal authorization, some as young as 8 or 9, bound into servitude for terms set by the colony rather than by any choice a parent or the child themselves had made. The Virginia Company's own correspondence from the period treats the arrangement as a straightforward administrative solution, children who were a burden on London's parish system converted into an asset for a colony that needed hands in the tobacco fields regardless of how small those hands were. Very few of these children appear in any later record under their own names. They were young enough and poor enough to begin with that almost nothing else was ever written about them, which makes the handful of surviving shipping lists among the only proof that this particular chapter happened at all. It is worth being precise here about what this system was and was not, because the two get conflated online more often than serious historians are comfortable with. Indentured servitude, however brutal in practice, was a contract with a defined end date, enforceable in court by the servant as well as the master, and it did not pass by law to a servant's children. The servant who survived their term walked away a free person with a legal claim to freedom dues. Chattel slavery, as it developed for enslaved Africans and their descendants across the same colonies during the very same decades, was none of those things. It was hereditary, permanent, and enforced by a body of law specifically written to make it neither a contract nor a temporary condition. The two systems briefly existed side by side on many of the same Chesapeake plantations in the 1600s, working the same tobacco rows under broadly similar physical conditions, which is part of why the two get blurred together in family lore and, more recently, in online argument. But the legal architecture separating them was real, deliberate, and became sharper rather than softer as the 17th century went on, and any honest account of one has to hold the line on what actually distinguished it from the other. How harsh any of this actually was depended heavily on where a servant ended up, and the Chesapeake tobacco colonies earned their reputation as the worst of it for a specific, well-documented reason. New arrivals to 17th-century Virginia and Maryland faced what colonists themselves called seasoning, a period of adjustment to unfamiliar disease environments, malaria chief among them, that killed close to half of some communities' newcomers within their first 2 years, regardless of whether they had arrived bound or free. For a servant, this meant a 4 to 7 year term was not simply a stretch of hard labor to be endured. It was a wager on surviving long enough to collect on it at all. Pennsylvania, settled later and shaped in part by Quaker sensibilities about the treatment of bound labor, generally saw somewhat milder conditions and lower mortality, and the rice-growing low country of South Carolina, once it developed later still, became by most accounts the most lethal destination of all for anyone working its fields, servant or enslaved alike. A servant who understood the odds in the Chesapeake specifically had every reason to treat an early buyout as more than simple ambition. It could be the difference between collecting freedom dues in person and never collecting them at all. Whatever brought a person into this system, the end of it was governed by actual law, not by a master's mercy. Virginia and Maryland both required what the statutes called freedom dues, a fixed payment in goods that a master owed a servant who completed a full term, typically a suit of clothes and a supply of corn, and in the earliest decades of the colony, sometimes 50 acres of land as well, though that particular provision faded as the free population grew and colonial assemblies had less interest in creating new landowners out of former servants. County court order books from this period are full of servants suing former masters who tried to withhold these dues, and the courts, at least on paper, generally sided with the servant when the contract and the timeline were clear. This is the paperwork that survives best. A dispute generates a record in a way that a quiet, uneventful completion of service rarely does, which means the loudest voices in the archive are often the ones who had to fight for what they were legally owed. The word indenture itself comes from the physical shape of the document. Clerks wrote both copies of a servant's contract on a single sheet of paper or parchment, one for the master and one for the servant, then cut the two apart along a deliberately irregular, jagged line rather than a straight one. If a dispute ever arose over whether a contract was genuine, the two halves could be fitted back together, and only a matching, unforged cut would line up correctly along every tooth of the edge. It was a simple, physical anti-fraud measure from an era with no other reliable way to verify a document, and it is the reason every one of these contracts, however different the terms, carried the same name. What survives today in an archive is sometimes only half of that original indenture, the master's copy, since a servant with almost no possessions and constant physical labor ahead of them had little practical way to preserve a piece of paper for 4 to 7 years. The imbalance in what survived is itself a kind of evidence, a reminder that the paper trail this history depends on was never created with equal care for both sides of the contract. Ending a term early was a different matter entirely, and a much rarer one, because it required cash that almost no servant possessed on their own. The mechanism existed. A servant could refund a master for the unexpired portion of their contract, calculated against what the master had originally paid for their passage and labor, and walk free before their legal term expired. In practice, this meant a servant needed help. A relative already settled in the colony with money to spare, a side trade practiced during whatever hours a master allowed, a skilled cooper or blacksmith selling extra work on a Sunday, and setting the proceeds aside for years at a time. Occasionally, a new master willing to advance the buyout sum against a fresh contract of paid labor, effectively trading one form of bondage for a shorter, wage-earning one. County order books record the outcome of these arrangements far more often than the negotiation itself. A single line noting that a certain sum changed hands between two named individuals, and that a servant's remaining time was thereby discharged, is often the entire surviving account of what must have been years of saving, favor trading, and hope. What a surviving buyout entry actually looks like on the page is almost disappointing in its plainness, and that plainness is exactly the point. What you are looking at, in a typical county order book, is a single line squeezed between a boundary dispute and a stray hog complaint, something close to received of the said servant the sum owed for the remainder of his time, and discharged accordingly. No name of who lent the money, no mention of how many years it took to save it, no record of the conversation, if there was one, between a servant and whichever relative, employer, or benefactor made the payment possible. The court did not care about the story behind the transaction. It only needed to record that the transaction had legally occurred, which means every buyout that survives in the archive today survives as a bare fact with the human effort behind it stripped almost entirely away. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What survives from inside the experience itself is rarer still, which is part of why the handful of documented voices matter as much as they do. Richard Frethorne, an indentured servant at Martin's Hundred in Virginia, wrote a series of letters to his parents in 1623, begging them to buy him out of his contract or send food, describing conditions so severe that he did not expect to survive the year. According to the letters that still exist in the archive, he never received an answer, and there is no further record of him after that year, which historians generally take as its own kind of answer. More than a century later, in 1756, a servant named Elizabeth Sprigs wrote her father in England from Maryland, describing similarly brutal treatment, work from before daylight until well past dark, and punishment that she compared directly to the treatment of livestock. Her letter survives because it was published in a London newspaper at the time, one of the very few instances where a servant's own words reached print rather than disappearing into a private correspondence that nobody kept. Neither Frethorne nor Sprigs bought their own freedom. Their letters exist precisely because they could not. What they describe is the baseline condition that made buying out, for the servants who managed it, worth every year of saving it required. The economic historian David Gallinson spent much of his career trying to put hard numbers on exactly how large this system actually was, working from surviving Bristol and London registers, Virginia and Maryland court records, and shipping manifests where they exist. His estimates, along with those of other historians working the same archives, put the number of indentured servants who crossed to the colonies south of New England somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of all European immigrants to that region before the Revolution. That is not a marginal footnote to colonial history. For roughly a century and a half, most of the white population arriving in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania came bound rather than free, which makes the families who eventually rewrote themselves as free settlers not an exception to the pattern, but, statistically, the more unusual case. None of this shows up in a single tidy list the way a parish baptism record does, which is part of why so many families lost the thread entirely, but the record does exist, spread across several distinct collections depending on which wave of bound labor a particular family came through. Peter Wilson Coldham spent decades compiling English court and shipping records into a series of reference volumes, among them Bonded Passengers to America, which indexes tens of thousands of convicts and indentured servants by name, court, sentence, and ship. Strasburger and Hincke did the same work for the German-speaking Redemptioners, publishing Pennsylvania German pioneers from the original Philadelphia port lists, a resource still treated as close to definitive for anyone tracing a Pennsylvania Dutch surname back to its ship. David Dobson has done comparable work for Scottish emigration specifically, and the Bristol Record Office still holds its own servant register intact, 1654 to 1686, the direct product of the city's own attempt to stop kidnapping at its own docks. Search those Philadelphia port lists against the surnames common in Lancaster and Berks counties today, and the overlap is difficult to miss. Names like Stoltzfus, Zimmermann, Fischer, Byler, King, and Esch appear repeatedly among the German and Swiss families who arrived through Philadelphia across the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, many of them redemptioners whose passage debt was settled at dockside by a Pennsylvania farmer or tradesman before the family ever set foot inland. Some of these names are straightforward English renderings of the German original, Fischer from Fischer, King from Koenig, and the anglicization itself is sometimes the only visible trace of a family that arrived with nothing and, a generation or two later, simply decided that the English spelling suited them better than the reminder attached to the German one. The Scots-Irish migration produced its own dense cluster of surnames tied to bound passage rather than free settlement, though the record here is thinner and the individual connections harder to prove than the German lists allow. Boyd, Gordon, Wilson, Hamilton, and Campbell all appear repeatedly across Dobson's compiled directories of Scottish emigrants, some tied to Ulster tenancy arrangements that collapsed under rising rents, others tied more directly to the aftermath of Dunbar and Worcester, when prisoners of war were simply assigned to a ship rather than given any real choice in the matter. On the English convict side, the surnames are, frankly, less useful as an individual signal. Cox, Smith, Turner, and Wood turn up constantly across Coldham's transportation lists for the plain reason that they were already among the most common surnames in England before anyone was ever sentenced to anything. A name like that appearing in a convict transportation record tells you almost nothing on its own. It is worth searching the actual court and ship record by full name and county, rather than assuming anything from the surname alone, the same caution that applies to any surname common enough to have arrived in America a dozen different ways for a dozen different reasons. Once a family had land of their own, the incentive to keep any of this in living memory dropped sharply, and in most cases it disappears from family memory within 2 generations. A former servant who married well, or who simply outlived the stigma long enough to become a respected planter or tradesman, had every reason to let the word servant fall out of how the family described itself, without ever announcing the change. The court records did not need to be destroyed for this to happen. They simply needed to stop being mentioned at the supper table, and after enough decades of silence, an indenture bond or a freedom dues receipt in a courthouse basement outlives the memory of the person it was written about by more than a century. The convict cases carried the heaviest weight of all, for reasons that are not hard to understand. A transported felon who served out a sentence and then simply stayed in the colonies, becoming a tenant farmer or a tradesman under a name nobody back in England was checking on, had every reason in the world to let the earlier conviction disappear entirely. Some did exactly that by using an alias from the moment they stepped off the ship, a documented practice that genealogists researching convict ancestry run into constantly, and one that makes the paper trail considerably harder to follow than it is for a redemptioner family whose name simply got easier to spell over time. The contrast with how another former British colony eventually handled the exact same category of ancestor is worth pausing on. Australia's convict founding population carried a nearly identical stigma for well over a century, referred to euphemistically, if at all, as the convict stain, before public attitudes there shifted decisively in the second half of the 20th century toward treating convict ancestry as a source of pride rather than embarrassment, something closer to a founding credential than a shameful secret. American descendants of transported felons never really got the equivalent moment. The convict passengers who crossed to Virginia and Maryland in the 1700s arrived a full colony's lifetime before there was an independent American identity for that history to eventually attach itself to with any pride, and by the time genealogy became a popular hobby on this side of the Atlantic, the story had already been absorbed and dissolved into a much larger, much less specific narrative of hard-working early settlers. Land records make the shift visible in a way that family stories almost never do. A man described in one county deed as a servant, or occasionally by the blunter word bound, reappears 5 or 10 years later in a completely different document, a will or a tax list, described simply as a planter or a yeoman, with no acknowledgement anywhere in the paper trail that anything had changed about him except his legal status and, apparently, the word the clerk reached for when writing his name down. The transformation from servant to landowner was real. Freedom dues, a small Headright grant, or a hard-won early buyout could genuinely turn a person with nothing into a person with 50 acres and a horse within a decade. And once that happened, the earlier word attached to his name in an older document became, for practical purposes, a piece of paper nobody had any reason to go looking for again. Family Bibles from this era, where they survive at all, tend to record births, marriages, and deaths with real care and almost nothing else, which means the servitude itself rarely appears even where the family clearly knew about it. What survives instead, when it survives at all, is a single sentence handed down with no elaboration attached to it. She came over bound, he worked off his passage before he could marry. Nobody in the family knows more than that one line, and for a long time, nobody had any way of confirming whether it was even true or simply a piece of old family embarrassment that had calcified into something closer to legend. That is usually where the actual discovery happens, when someone finally goes looking for the document behind the sentence, instead of accepting the sentence itself as the whole story. A county order book entry naming a servant by full name, a term of years, and the date the term ended. A freedom dues payment recorded in the same flat clerk's hand, used for every other transaction that week. Occasionally an actual indenture bond, the original contract itself, folded into a probate file because the master who signed it happened to die before the servant's term was up, and the document had to be settled as part of his estate. None of these documents apologize for themselves or explain their own significance. They simply record a transaction the way the era recorded every transaction, and it is only against the family's own half-remembered sentence that the transaction reveals what it actually was, proof of exactly the thing the family had spent 150 years quietly declining to mention in full. Modern DNA testing adds one more layer to this, though a lighter one than the paperwork itself provides. Commercial genetic testing companies now group customers into what they call genetic communities. Clusters of people whose ancestors are statistically likely to have lived in the same place during the same era, based on shared segments of DNA across thousands of tested customers. A cluster built around Colonial Virginia, or the Pennsylvania German settlements, does not distinguish between a family that arrived free and a family that arrived bound. It cannot. The genome does not record a legal status, only a location and a rough era. What it can do is nudge a researcher toward the right county and the right decade, which is often enough to know exactly which archive to search next: the Bristol Register, the Philadelphia Port Lists, or a Virginia County Order Book, depending on where the cluster points. Searching any of this today is considerably easier than it would have been even 20 years ago. Ancestry and Family Search have both digitized large portions of the Virginia and Maryland County Order Books, keyword searchable rather than requiring a researcher to scroll through reels of microfilm one county at a time. The Bristol Record Office has made portions of its servant register available for direct lookup. Coldham's volumes and Strasburger and Hinkey's ship lists have both been indexed and cross-referenced by multiple genealogical societies, meaning a full-name search across several of these collections at once is now realistic in an afternoon rather than a research trip. None of this makes the record complete. Entire counties lost their colonial-era court books to fire, flood, or simple neglect long before anyone thought to microfilm them. And Virginia in particular lost a large share of its earliest county records this way. But for the records that did survive, the barrier to finding them has genuinely dropped, and a family sentence with no evidence behind it for 150 years now has a real chance of being tested against an actual document within the length of a single sitting. What remains of all this, across every wave of it, is a paperwork record that never asked to be forgotten and mostly wasn't destroyed on purpose. Bristol's servant register still sits in its record office, 1654 to 1686, waiting for a surname search. Coldham's compiled volumes still index the convicts and the servants who were never convicts at all, side by side, exactly as the ships that carried them treated the two categories with roughly the same indifference. Strasburger and Hincke's Philadelphia lists still tie thousands of Pennsylvania Dutch surnames back to a specific ship and a specific year. Virginia and Maryland county order books, most of them now digitized and searchable by name, still record the freedom dues disputes and the early buyouts, the corn and clothes owed by law, and the rarer, harder-won line noting that a certain sum changed hands and a certain person's bondage ended before the law technically required it to. Somewhere between half and two-thirds of the Europeans who arrived in the colonies south of New England before the Revolution came over exactly this way, bound rather than free, and only a fraction of their descendants today know it. The family that eventually forgot the word servant did not erase the transaction itself. It only stopped repeating it out loud, and the clerk who wrote the transaction down in the first place was never asking anyone's permission to keep the record either way. A freedom dues receipt does not care whether a family remembers the person it names. A Bristol servant register entry from 1662 does not care whether 3 centuries of descendants believed something else about how their ancestors arrived. The paper simply sits where it was filed, indifferent to whatever version of the story the family eventually settled on telling itself at the supper table. What changed over the generations was never the underlying fact. It was only who still knew it, and how loudly they were willing to say it out loud once they no longer needed the silence to protect anything. If a name on this list sits in your own family tree, the ledger it came from is very likely still exactly where it has always been, on a shelf in a courthouse basement or a state archive that was never particularly interested in whether anyone came looking for it, and is not going anywhere now that someone finally has. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.